She was 58 years old, had $40 in her checking account, and no plan beyond what her hands were already doing. She had driven past that farm every morning for 6 months. Every morning, she had seen the same thing: a horse standing in a pen barely large enough to turn around in, hip bones pressing through his coat like a sentence written in a language nobody wanted to read. Every morning, she had told herself someone else would do something. Someone with more resources, more authority, more standing in the county. Someone better positioned to make it matter. Then one Tuesday in November, she stopped the truck. What happened after she stopped? What that horse would do for her? What he would survive? What he would ultimately reveal about the kind of person she'd quietly become? That is the story this video is going to tell. And I promise you, by the end, you will not believe that it started with $40 and a woman who had already been through enough. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something real. This story involves a woman who steps in when she has no reason to, when the practical math of her life says keep driving. And I want to know, have you ever done that? Stopped when you could have kept going. For an animal, for a stranger, for something that was none of your business by any logical measure? Leave your answer in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from, your city, your state, your country. This channel exists because of the people who show up for stories like this one, and I want to know who you are. If this story finds something in you before it's even finished, leave a like. And if you're new here, subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell. All right, let's go back to that Tuesday morning in November. The town of Delwood, Tennessee, sits in a crease between two long ridges in the eastern part of the state. The kind of geography that gives a place a slightly enclosed feeling, like the world outside it is theoretical. It's not a small town in the photogenic sense. There's no historic square, no autumn festival that draws visitors from Nashville. It's a working town, a grain co-op, 2 diners, a high school whose enrollment has been declining for 15 years, and the particular silence of a community that has been losing its young people to cities the way a field loses topsoil. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. Adrienne Mosley had lived there her entire life, which is to say she had seen all of it happen. She was 58 years old when this story begins. She had worked 22 years at the county extension office, helping farmers navigate grants, regulations, crop assistance programs, bureaucratic translation work, essentially, the kind that requires a person who is simultaneously patient and dogged and not easily impressed by the way institutional processes present themselves. She was good at it. She was also, by the time she left, deeply tired of it. She had retired 2 years earlier, not by design, but by circumstance. Her mother had developed a late-stage neurodegenerative condition, and the care schedule had made continued employment impossible. Her mother passed 14 months ago. The grief was still present, though it had changed shape, less acute, more like a weight she'd learned to distribute. She owned a small property on the eastern edge of Delwood. 4 acres, a farmhouse that needed more maintenance than she could consistently afford, and a modest barn she had converted, in an optimistic period shortly after retirement, into a workshop where she occasionally built furniture. She was good at that, too. The furniture sold at a craft fair in Knoxville twice a year, and combined with a modest pension and what remained of her mother's small estate, it kept her functional. Not comfortable, exactly. Functional. She had no animals. She had considered it. Specifically, she had considered a horse, which she had ridden as a teenager and thought about with a periodic wistfulness that she usually managed to talk herself out of by reviewing her bank balance. The farm where the horse was kept belonged to a man named Deke Farrand. Deke was 63, had farmed the same 200 acres since inheriting them from his father, and had a reputation in the county that covered a wide range, from reliable to difficult, to, among certain people who'd had direct dealings with him, someone you don't turn your back on. He was not liked universally, but he was known, which in a county like this one amounted to a kind of social currency. The horse had appeared on his property roughly 2 years earlier. A neighbor told Adrienne later that Deke had taken the animal in lieu of a debt. Someone owed him money, didn't have it, gave him the horse as settlement. The horse was a Belgian draft, an older one, 17 years by the estimate of the vet who would later examine him, which is not young for a draft horse that has worked. He was dark bay with a flaxen mane, and he had the physical architecture of an animal that had once been magnificent: deep chest, powerful hindquarters, the structural memory of strength. But the 2 years in Deke's care had done what neglect does systematically and without any particular malice. It had unmade him. The pen was approximately 30 by 40 feet. For a horse of that size, it was confining to the edge of cruelty. There was a water trough, but Adrian had seen it frozen and unbroken on mornings cold enough to matter. There was hay, intermittently. There was no shelter from the weather, not a run-in, not a roof, not so much as a windbreak in the prevailing direction. The horse stood through Tennessee winters in an open pen in a state of physical deterioration that Adrian had watched progress for 6 months. She had called the county animal control office in September. They had sent someone to investigate. Deke had been issued a warning about the water trough. The horse was assessed as being in suboptimal, but not legally actionable condition. That word, suboptimal, had lodged in Adrienne's chest like something cold. She drove past the farm every morning because there was no other road that went where she needed to go. Every morning she looked. Every morning she kept driving. Until Tuesday. What made her stop on that particular Tuesday was not a new injury or a dramatic event. The horse was simply standing in the corner of the pen closest to the road, facing her truck as she slowed for the curve, and something in the angle of his head, not beseeching, not dramatic, just present, just looking, broke through whatever calculation she had been running for 6 months. She pulled over. She sat in the truck for about 2 minutes. Then she drove up the gravel road to Deke Farron's front door and knocked. It was 7:15 in the morning. Deke answered in a flannel shirt and the expression of a man who did not welcome unscheduled callers. "Your horse," Adrian said, before he could ask anything. "I want to buy him." Deke looked at her. He knew who she was. In Delwood, everybody knows who everybody is, at least by approximate category. "He's not for sale," Deke said. "What do you use him for?" A pause. "What business is that of yours?" "I've watched that animal for 6 months," Adrian said. She kept her voice level, not accusatory, just stating facts. "He has no shelter. His weight is wrong. The water was frozen in October. I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to give you money for something you're not using." Deke's expression moved through several phases: irritation, assessment, something that might have been consideration. "How much?" She had thought about this on the 2-minute drive up the gravel road. She named a number, $300. It was not a fair market price for a Belgian draft, even in poor condition. But she had a sense that Deke had not acquired the horse through any legitimate affection, and that the right appeal was to his accounting instinct rather than his sentiment. Deke looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Cash." She had $80 in her wallet. She told him she would bring the rest the next morning. He said fine. He said if she didn't show up with it, the deal was off and she could stop looking at his property on her way through. She agreed to the terms. She drove to Delwood's single ATM, withdrew $220, essentially the entirety of what she had available before her next pension deposit, and drove back. She handed Deke the money at 7:45. He counted it and put it in his shirt pocket without comment. "I'll need a week to arrange transport," she said. "He's your problem now," Deke said. He turned and went inside. She stood in the driveway for a moment and then walked around the side of the house to the pen. The horse was in the same corner where she'd first seen him that morning. She approached the fence slowly, the way she'd once been taught. No sudden movement, no direct eye contact, letting the animal register her presence without feeling cornered. He turned to look at her. His eyes were dark and quiet, not the eyes of an animal that had been destroyed, not vacant, not full of fear. They were watchful, and there was something in them she would describe later, imprecisely but accurately, as recognition. Not of her specifically, of intention, perhaps, of someone approaching without harm. She put her hand through the fence rail. He stood still for a long moment. Then he stepped toward her slowly and put his nose against her palm. She stood at that fence in the November cold and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. Not grief exactly, not joy exactly, but something adjacent to both. The feeling of a decision being the right one before you have any evidence that it is. She spent the rest of that day on the phone. She called the large animal vet in the county, a woman named Dr. Patricia All, and described what she had. Dr. All said she would come out to assess him within the week. She called a livestock transport service 2 counties over and arranged a trailer for Thursday. She called her friend Beverly, who had kept horses until 3 years ago and still had a pasture and a run-in shed, and asked if she could use the space for a short time while she prepared her own barn. Beverly said yes without asking any questions except what color he was. "Dark bay," Adrian said, "with a flaxen mane." "Lord," Beverly said. "He sounds beautiful." "He was," Adrian said. He will be again. She hung up the phone and sat in her workshop for a while, looking at a chair she'd been building for the Knoxville Fair. She did the math in her head the way she always did, carefully, honestly, with no rounding in the optimistic direction. She had spent $300 on a horse she had nowhere to keep, whose vet bills were entirely unknown, whose recovery timeline was entirely unknown, and whose value as anything other than herself she had not considered for a single moment. She felt no regret. She felt something closer to relief, which surprised her, and then didn't. The transport went smoothly, considering. The horse loaded with more willingness than the driver expected from an animal in his condition. Draft horses, the man said, often have a cooperative disposition that smaller breeds don't, a kind of stoic practicality bred into them over generations of work. He stood in the trailer quietly for the 40-minute drive to Beverly's farm, and when the ramp came down, he walked out into the winter pasture and stopped, and seemed to simply stand in the space of it. Beverly stood at the fence beside Adrian, and they both watched him. "He's going to need a name," Beverly said. Adrian had been thinking about this. She had not named him yet. It had felt presumptuous, somehow, while he was still in that pen. Now, watching him stand in the open field with his head slightly raised, tasting the air with his dark nostrils, she said, "Roan." "He's not roan-colored," Beverly pointed out. "No," Adrian agreed, "but it's what came to mind." Roan it was. Dr. Patricia all came out 2 days later. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with the careful, efficient manner of someone who has spent decades delivering difficult news about beloved things and has learned to be direct without being unkind. She examined Roan methodically: teeth, hooves, body condition score, palpation of the major muscle groups, a blood panel. Her assessment took about an hour. 17, maybe 18 years old, she said when she was done, washing her hands at the outdoor tap. Body condition score of 3, which is significantly underweight. There's some joint stiffness consistent with age and hard work. I'd want x-rays to rule out anything more serious, but it doesn't feel pathological, just wear. His teeth are in surprisingly decent shape, which tells me he was well cared for at some earlier point in his life. Hooves need immediate attention. I'd call the farrier this week. His blood work will tell us more, but my read is that this is a horse who has been neglected, not abused in the acute sense. Given the right nutrition and time, he should come back significantly. How much time? Adrian asked. 3 to 6 months to see meaningful improvement. A year to see what he really is. And cost? Dr. All gave her a realistic number. It was not small. Adrian nodded and thanked her and did not let her face change. After Dr. All left, Beverly came out of the house with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Adrian, who was still standing at the fence watching Roan move slowly around the pasture. "How are you doing this?" Beverly asked, not judgmentally, just with the directness of someone who has been friends with a person long enough to dispense with tact. "I don't entirely know," Adrian said. "The Knoxville Fair is in March. I have 3 chairs and a side table that are close to done, and I need to sell the dining set I've been putting off finishing." "That's not really an answer." "No," Adrian admitted, "but it's all the answer I have right now." What she didn't say, because she hadn't fully articulated it even to herself, was that taking the horse had done something unexpected to the quality of her days. The 2 years since leaving the extension office had been marked by a flatness she'd attributed to grief, and then to adjustment, and then, more honestly, to a loss of purpose that she hadn't seen coming. The furniture helped. It was not enough. Roan was not a solution to that. She knew that. But the daily necessity of his care, the feeding schedule Dr. All had recommended, the monitoring of his weight, the twice-daily checks that the farrier had requested while the hoofwork was in progress. It imposed a structure on her mornings and evenings that the days had been lacking. Not busyness, exactly. More like directionality. A reason to be somewhere specific at a specific time, which is, it turned out, something she had needed more than she knew. Word traveled through Delwood the way it always does. Through the co-op, through the diners, through the particular social architecture of a small town where everyone's business is quietly everyone else's. Most people receive the story with the mild interest that stories of eccentric behavior generate in communities where eccentricity is tolerated but noted. A widow spending her savings on a ruined horse from Deke Farron's place. Something to talk about for a week, and then the next thing would come along. But 2 specific people heard the story and had more than mild reactions. The first was a woman named Greta Sundell, who ran a small horse rescue organization called Second Chance Hooves from a farm about 20 miles east of Delwood. She heard about Roan through a mutual contact with Beverly, and she called Adrian on a Thursday evening to ask if she needed help. The second was Deke Farrand himself, who had apparently heard something that displeased him, though exactly what it was, Adrian wouldn't understand until later. Greta Sundell was the kind of person who made an impression not by being loud, but by being precise. She was in her early 60s, had run Second Chance Hooves for 11 years, and knew more about equine rescue and recovery than most licensed vets, not because she had formal training, but because she had the particular expertise that comes from doing a difficult thing repeatedly and paying close attention to what works. She had pulled horses back from conditions worse than Roan's. She had also, in those 11 years, learned to quickly identify the people who would follow through on a rescue and the people who would not. She came to Beverly's farm the Saturday after she called, drove out in a dusty pickup with a border collie asleep in the passenger seat, and walked around Roan for about 10 minutes without saying much. Then she looked at Adrian. "He's got good bone structure," Greta said. "That counts for a lot at this stage. The muscle will come back if the nutrition is right. Dr. All gave me a feeding plan," Adrian said. "Patricia's good. You following it exactly?" "Yes." Greta looked at her steadily. "People say that. What does exactly mean to you?" Adrian described the schedule, the quantities, the hay type, the supplements. She described what she was observing in Roan's energy and movement each day and what she was writing in the notebook she'd started keeping. Greta listened without interrupting. "All right," Greta said. "What do you need?" "I need him to get to where I can move him to my property. My barn isn't set up for a draft. I need to modify the stall dimensions and get a run-in built on the east side of the pasture. I can do some of that work myself, but the construction is beyond what I can manage alone. I can send you a volunteer who's good with a hammer," Greta said. "He comes on weekends. Can you source the materials?" "I can if I space out the purchases. I have time." Greta nodded. "And the rest of it? The feed, the farrier, the follow-up vet work, you're managing that on your own?" Adrian said yes. She said it in the straightforward way of someone who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it, and Greta seemed to recognize that quality because she didn't push. What Greta did instead was something Adrian hadn't asked for. She filed a formal complaint with the state agriculture department regarding Roan's prior conditions at the Farrand farm. She had photographs she'd taken during her visit, and she submitted them along with the vet's assessment notes, which Dr. All had provided to Adrian in writing. The complaint documented the inadequate shelter, the water issues, and the body condition score at the time of removal. Adrian found out about the complaint when Deke Farrand appeared at the end of her driveway 2 weeks later. He didn't come up to the house. He sat in his truck at the bottom of the drive for several minutes, which Adrian noticed from the kitchen window, and then he drove away. But 2 days after that, she received a letter from a lawyer in Knoxville asserting that the sale of the horse had been coerced and that Farrand was demanding the animal's return or an additional payment of $2,000. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table. She set it down. She made a cup of tea. She read it again. It was, she quickly recognized, a harassment strategy rather than a legitimate legal claim. The sale had been voluntary. Deke had named his price and accepted her cash in front of 2 witnesses because the transport driver had been present for part of the transaction. There was nothing to sustain a coercion claim, but it was designed to make her feel unsafe, and it accomplished that, at least briefly. She called a legal aid office in Knoxville that she knew from her years at the extension office. She spoke with a lawyer named Marcus, who reviewed the situation and told her what she suspected. The claim was without merit, and a brief, formal response through the legal aid office would almost certainly end it. Marcus wrote the response. It went out within a week. She heard nothing more from Farrand's lawyer, but the experience left a residue. She started locking her workshop at night, which she hadn't previously done. She started paying attention to the trucks that drove past her property, which she hadn't previously needed to do. It was a low-grade wariness that she carried with the matter-of-fact resignation of someone who has dealt with difficult men before and knows that naming the feeling accurately is more useful than pretending it isn't there. Through all of this, Rome was getting better. It was slow, the way real recovery always is. Not a narrative arc, but an accumulation of small changes. A few pounds gained each week, a gradual brightening in his eye, a willingness to move that hadn't been there in those first cautious days at Beverly's. The joint stiffness Dr. All had noted was still present, but it loosened as he moved, which she took as a good sign, and the blood panel had come back without anything alarming. One morning, about 6 weeks after the rescue, Adrian arrived at Beverly's to find Roan standing in the center of the pasture with his head raised and his ears forward, looking at something in the tree line she couldn't identify, and he looked, for the first time, like what he was. Not broken, not ruined, something that had been through a great deal and was still, fundamentally, itself. She stood at the fence and watched him for a while. Beverly came out with coffee, as Beverly did. "He's going to be beautiful," Beverly said. "He already is," Adrian said. Which was true, and which was also, she understood, not the end of anything, just a point along a road that was still going somewhere she couldn't quite see. The volunteer Greta sent was a young man named Theo, 26 years old, who had the quiet, competent quality of someone who learned things from watching rather than from being told. He arrived on a Saturday in January in a truck that was only slightly less dusty than Greta's, looked at Adrienne's barn with the evaluating eye of someone who knew what they were looking at, and said, "I can have the stall done in 2 weekends. The run-in is going to take 3, maybe 4, depending on weather." He was right on both counts. Over those weeks of construction, Adrian and Theo developed the particular rapport that forms between people who are working on something physical together, largely wordless, organized around the task, built on the shared language of what needs to happen next. He was not a talker. Neither was she. They worked well. She learned, in small pieces, that he had grown up on a farm outside Knoxville, that he'd spent 3 years doing construction work before finding his way to Greta's organization through a friend, and that he had a background with draft horses specifically. His grandfather had kept Belgians. This last piece of information came out one afternoon when he was running his hand along Roan's neck with the familiarity of someone who had done exactly that before. "He's going to need a job," Theo said, in the same practical tone he used when discussing lumber. "He's recovering," Adrian said. "I know, but draft horses don't do well long-term without work. Not actual work, not pulling tons of anything, not at his age and in his condition. But something, a purpose." He looked at her. "What are you going to do with him?" She had been thinking about this and had not yet arrived at an answer. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Theo nodded, as though that were an acceptable place to be. In February, Roan moved to Adrienne's property. The transition was managed carefully. Dr. All was present for the first week's check-in afterward, and Greta drove by twice to assess. He settled into the new space with the measured equanimity that had come to seem characteristic of him, alert but not anxious, observant but not reactive. Adrienne found her days reorganizing themselves around his rhythms. She was in the barn before breakfast and after dinner. She walked him in the small paddock Theo had finished alongside the run-in, 30 minutes in the morning, longer on the weekends. The walks were not exercise in any demanding sense. They were calibrated to his recovery, but they were steady, and they were together, and she found that they had become the part of the day she thought about most when she was doing other things. Her furniture output increased during this period, which surprised her. She had expected the additional responsibility to crowd her working hours. Instead, something about the structure of Roan's care, the regularity of it, the dailiness, seemed to sharpen the rest of her time. She finished the dining set in February. She built 2 additional chairs for the Knoxville Fair. She started, for the first time in years, a rocking chair, which was technically the most complex piece she'd attempted and which she had been putting off for reasons she couldn't entirely name. In late February, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a woman named Dolores, who introduced herself as a representative of the county's Agricultural Extension Office, the office where Adrienne had spent 22 years of her working life. "We've been following what you've done," Dolores said, "with the horse rescue. And I want to be direct with you. We have a rural youth engagement program that we've been trying to build for 2 years. We've been looking for something that can anchor it, something that gives kids from the county a reason to come out to a farm setting, learn responsibility, learn animal care. Something real, not packaged." And someone brought up your name. Adrienne was quiet for a moment. "Who brought up my name?" "Greta Sundell," Dolores said. "Of course. What exactly would this involve?" Adrienne asked. The program Dolores described was modest in its current form, a Saturday program, 8 to 12 kids from the county's lower-income communities, monthly visits to a participating farm, focused on animal husbandry and basic agricultural skills. The Extension Office provided the curriculum and the liability coverage. The farm provided the space and the anchor animal, the thing that made a kid want to come back the following month. "A draft horse," Dolores said, "is ideal for this. They're gentle with children. They have a presence that's impossible to manufacture. And yours has a story. Kids respond to that. Adrian sat with the proposal for several days. She talked to Beverly. She talked to Theo, who had continued stopping by on weekends to help with paddock improvements and who had become, without any formal arrangement, a kind of ongoing presence in the project. She talked to Roan, who listened with his characteristic attentiveness and offered no objection. She called Dolores back the first week of March and said yes. The Knoxville Craft Fair happened the third weekend of March, and Adrian sold nearly everything she'd brought. The chairs, the dining set, the side table, and the rocking chair, which she had finished the week before and which sold within the first hour of the first day to a woman from Nashville who said it was the most beautiful functional object she'd seen in 3 years of attending the fair. The income was the best she'd had from a fair in 6 years. She drove back to Delwood on Sunday evening with the truck empty and her finances, for the first time since she'd bought Roan, looking something other than precarious. She stopped at the barn before going inside. Roan was in the run-in, out of the rain that had started on the highway, and followed her home. She stood at the fence and watched him for a while in the soft gray light, and she felt, very clearly and without drama, that she had arrived somewhere she had been heading without knowing it. The first session of the extension program was scheduled for the second Saturday in April. Dolores had enrolled 9 children, ages 9 through 14, from 3 communities in the county. A volunteer coordinator named Iris would accompany the group. Theo had agreed to help with the session. Adrian spent the week before preparing the property. She cleaned the barn with more thoroughness than it had ever received from her. She set up a small seating area in the paddock with hay bales and a whiteboard she'd found in her attic. She thought about what she wanted the children to understand, not in a curriculum planning way, but in the more fundamental way of what she believed about animals and work and care, and how to translate that into something a 10-year-old could hold. The morning of the session, she was up at 5. 9 children arrived at 9:30 in a county van, accompanied by Iris, who was organized and warm and had the specific competence of someone who has been working with children for a long time and knows how to hold the energy of a group without suppressing it. The children were at various points on the spectrum between eager and skeptical. 2 girls who ran to the fence immediately, 1 boy who stood back with his arms crossed, several who watched and waited, reserving judgment. Adrian introduced herself and then introduced Roan. He was standing in the center of the paddock when they arrived. She had brought him in from the pasture that morning and let him settle there, which he had done with his characteristic stillness. He looked at the group of children without alarm, his ears moving forward with what could only be described as interest. The boy with his arms crossed uncrossed them. She explained Roan's history in simple, direct terms. Where he had been, what condition he had been in, what the recovery had involved. She described the first morning she had stopped the truck, how the decision had been made, how it had felt to knock on a stranger's door with $40 in her wallet and no plan beyond the present moment. She told this not as a hero narrative, but as an honest one. The fear that had been there, the math that hadn't added up, the way she'd done it anyway. Then she opened the paddock gate and let the children in, one by one, with instructions about approach and stillness. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic. It was something quieter and more permanent than drama. Each child, in turn, stood beside Roan and learned to place a hand on his neck. He was patient with all of them, patient with the girl who moved too fast and startled and then overcorrected into frozen terror, patient with the boy who approached so slowly it took 4 minutes, patient with the smaller children who had to be lifted slightly to reach his neck comfortably. He stood in the April sunshine and accepted every tentative hand with a stillness that seemed, to Adrian watching from outside the gate, almost deliberate. The boy who had stood with his arms crossed, whose name she would learn was Jasper, 11 years old, from the eastern edge of the county, stood next to Roan the longest. He had come forward last, and when he put his hand on the horse's neck, he stood there without speaking for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "He's not scared of us." "No," Adrian said, "he isn't." Jasper looked at her over the fence. "How do you teach a horse that?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm not sure you teach it. I think it's more that you stop giving them reasons to be afraid, and you wait. And eventually the fear fades because nothing bad keeps happening." Jasper turned that over for a moment, and she could see him doing it, the way children sometimes carry an answer further than you intend, into the parts of their own experience you can't see. He nodded slowly and looked back at Roan. The session lasted 3 hours. By the end, the children had learned to groom a horse, had watched Dr. All, who had volunteered her time for the day, demonstrate a basic health assessment, had helped distribute hay, and had sat in the paddock asking questions about draft horses, about rescue, about what Adrian did with the rest of her time. One girl, whose name was Simone, asked, "Did you know it was going to work out when you bought him?" Adrian thought about being honest and decided there was no better option. "No," she said. "I had no idea. I had a feeling that stopping was right, and I had just enough courage to act on it. That's all." Simone looked at Roan and then back at Adrian. "That's a lot, though," she said. The van pulled away at noon. Adrian stood in the driveway and watched it go, and Theo came to stand beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. "Jasper," he said finally. "I know," she said. Something had happened in that paddock with Jasper that neither of them had planned or anticipated. A quality of meeting between a child and an animal that happened sometimes and couldn't be manufactured and didn't need to be explained. She had seen it in his face when he finally looked up at Roan. She had seen the thing that happens when a creature who can't lie and can't perform makes contact with a person who has been expecting, at some fundamental level, to be disappointed. She called Dolores that evening and asked about the possibility of increasing the program to twice a month. Dolores said she'd need to check the budget, but her tone said yes. 3 weeks later, it was confirmed, and Deke Farron drove past her driveway twice that month and never slowed down. By summer, the program had a name, Open Gate, and 12 enrolled participants, 3 more than the original 9. Dolores had found a small grant through the state agriculture department to cover materials and a modest stipend for Iris, whose coordination had been entirely voluntary. Greta Sundell had come out twice to observe and had recommended the program to 2 other counties as a potential model. Adrian had not intended to create a program. She had intended to save one horse. The distance between those 2 things was not something she had planned and could not have planned, because it had assembled itself from decisions made without a map, and it looked nothing like anything she had imagined at 7:15 on a November morning when she had pulled over on the side of a county road. She had a conversation with Beverly on a warm evening in June, sitting on Beverly's porch with iced tea and the particular ease of a friendship that no longer needed to perform itself. Beverly asked her how she was. Not how the horse was, not how the program was, but how she was. Adrian thought about it. "Better than I've been in a long time," she said. "Not better than I was before everything, before Edgar died, before Mama got sick, but different from the flatness that came after. Like I've come back to a version of myself that I was afraid had gone away." Beverly was quiet for a moment. "What do you think did it?" "Stopping the truck," Adrian said. "And the everything that came after was just the consequence of that." Roan's 6-month assessment, conducted by Dr. All in May, had shown a body condition score of 5.5, from a 3 to a 5.5 in 6 months, which Patricia said was better than she'd projected. His joint stiffness had improved significantly with consistent movement and a targeted supplement protocol. His coat had the density and sheen of an animal that was no longer spending its metabolic resources on survival alone. He was, objectively, measurably, a different horse. He was also, in some harder-to-quantify sense, a known horse. Not known in the sense of famous. Known in the sense that his character had emerged clearly. The patience, the steadiness, the particular quality of attention he gave to children that seemed calibrated to exactly what they needed. He was not performing ease. He was at ease. There was a difference, and the children in the program felt it, and it was doing something for them that the curriculum could not have done alone. Jasper came to every session. He had started, with permission and under Theo's supervision, helping with the morning feeding on certain Saturdays, arriving early before the group sessions began. He was quiet and careful, and he listened more than he spoke, which Adrian recognized as a form of intelligence she had always respected. One morning he asked her why she had named the horse Roan when he wasn't roan-colored. She told him the truth. It was what had come to mind, and she hadn't questioned it. He thought about this. "I think names should mean something," he said. "They usually do," she said, "even when we don't know what yet." He looked at the horse. "Maybe it means he was supposed to be something and got interrupted," he said. "And Roan is like the version of him that still remembers who he's supposed to be." She looked at him for a moment. "That," she said, "is exactly right." He looked slightly surprised, the way children do when an adult takes them entirely seriously. Then he went back to filling the water bucket, and she stood in the barn in the June morning, and thought that things sometimes exceed what you hoped for in ways that have nothing to do with what you planned. There is a version of Adrienne's story that you could tell as a rescue narrative. Woman saves horse. Horse saves woman. Symmetrical and satisfying. There are elements of that story that are true. But the actual story is less symmetrical and more interesting. The actual story is about what happens when a person who has been contracting, narrowing, slowly, the way people do after accumulated loss, suddenly expands again. Not by healing or by resolving anything, but by acting in a direction that had nothing to do with her own recovery and everything to do with what was right in front of her. Roan was 18 years old by Summer's best estimate. Draft horses live, in good conditions, into their mid-20s. He had, if the conditions held, a number of years remaining. Not a young horse's years, but real years, full ones. Dr. All had said, with characteristic precision, that she saw no reason his quality of life could not be excellent for a long time yet, provided the nutrition and care continued. The care continued. It would continue. Adrienne thought sometimes about Deke Farrand, not with anger, which had largely drained away by spring, but with the clinical curiosity she brought to things she didn't entirely understand. She didn't know what had made him keep an animal he wasn't using in conditions he clearly wasn't willing to improve. She didn't know if it was negligence or indifference or something more complicated, and she had decided that knowing wouldn't change anything useful. What she knew was that the state complaint Greta had filed had resulted in an inspection and a formal citation, and that Farron no longer kept livestock on his property. That was enough. In September, the county paper did a short feature on Open Gate. It was a modest piece, 3 paragraphs, a photograph of Roan in the paddock with 2 of the program participants, a brief quote from Dolores about the extension office's hopes for expanding the model. Adrienne's name appeared in the second paragraph. She read the article once and put the paper in the same drawer where she kept useful things. The photograph showed Roan from the side, his head turned slightly toward the camera, his coat the deep Bing gold that had fully returned by early summer. He looked patient and composed and entirely himself. Greta called after the piece ran and said she was getting calls from 3 other counties asking about the model. She sounded pleased in the understated way of someone who has been doing unglamorous work for a long time and has learned to receive acknowledgement without making too much of it. You started something, Greta said. I stopped a truck, Adrienne said. That's usually how it starts, Greta said. Theo had begun talking, by fall, about the possibility of establishing a formal connection between Second Chance Hooves and the Open Gate program, a pipeline for rescue animals that were temperamentally suited for youth programs, assessed and placed with care. The logistics were complicated and would take time. He was, Adrienne had come to understand, someone who worked well with complicated things that took time. She thought he would figure it out. She thought Jasper would keep coming on Saturdays, and that eventually he would know more about horses than she did, and that would be exactly right. She thought Roan would stand in the paddock in the October light with his ears forward and his coat catching the sun, and that the children would line up at the gate the way they always did, a little loud, a little uncertain, falling quiet when they got close to him, and that something would happen in that quiet, something that could not be quantified or timed or described precisely, but that was, nonetheless, real. That is what she thought. That is, as far as she could see, what was going to happen. She was mostly right. There is a question at the center of this story, and it's not the one that sounds most urgent. The question that sounds most urgent is, why did she stop? Why did she knock on that door with $40 and no plan? Why did she spend money she didn't have on an animal she didn't need? But that question, I think, has a simple answer. She stopped because the horse was there and was suffering, and she was present and was capable of doing something. The math, finally, was that simple. The more interesting question is what stopping made possible. Not just for the horse, though it made possible his life, which is not a small thing, but for the program, for the children, for Jasper asking about the name Roan on a quiet Saturday morning, for the way that one woman's decision to act without a plan generated a current that ran through a small Tennessee county and reached places she never could have aimed at. You cannot plan for that. You can only stop the truck. There is something in this story about loss and what comes after it. Not healing. Exactly. Because some losses don't heal, they just integrate. They become part of the structure of a life rather than a wound in it. Adrienne lost her husband. She lost her mother. She lost years to care that was real and necessary, and that narrowed the world to a smaller perimeter than she had planned. And what she found on the other side of all of that was not a restored version of who she had been before. She found something different, something built from what had been given back to her by necessity and from what she had chosen to give. One decision. On a Tuesday, in November, if you are watching this and you have driven past something that asked something of you and you kept going, that's okay. Most of us do. Most of the time, for most things, the moment passes and the cost of acting was more than we were ready for, and the loss is small, and we carry it quietly. But if you haven't stopped the truck yet, if there is something at the end of your particular county road that has been waiting at the fence, then maybe this story is the permission you were looking for. The horse is still there. He's always still there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. And I'll see you in the next one.